Okay, so my name is Yo-Yo. I am an assistant professor at UCL Institute of Education, and I'm a social and personality psychologist. And my research uses lots of computational methods, working with big data. And this research that I'm presenting is part of a research that I do in meta science, and this research is a joint effort with my collaborators, Dr. Yang from Syracuse University and Professor Brian Woosie from Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University. So this talk is about replication. I assume you all know what the replication is. I'd like to start by reminding you why we do replications in the first place. And there are a couple of reasons. So the first main reason or main purpose of doing replication is to evaluate the overall reliability of research in a discipline. So you want to know in general how replicable psychology research is, for example. And that is different from another purpose of replication, which is to assess the truthfulness or robustness of specific findings. For instance, you want to know whether we can trust the ego depletion effect in social psychology, and then you focus on just that effect. So these two purposes, they differ in the way replications are done. Oh, sorry. Suppose this grid on the screen represents all the findings in the literature in a discipline. This is like your entire literature. And if we do a replication for the first purpose, to evaluate the overall reliability in a discipline, we only need to choose like a random subset of studies and replicate this subset. An outcome would be the percentage of studies that were successfully replicated in that small subset. An example of that type of replication is, of course, RPP, reproducibility psychology. They replicated 100 social and cognitive psychology experiments and found that more than 60% could not be replicated. So from that random sample they took, we could infer the status of the entire literature. That was the purpose. And we estimated that in the entire literature, 60% of the studies could not, like approximately, could not be replicated. And the second purpose of replication sort of follows the outcome of the first purpose. Because we knew that the overall success rate is less than 40%, we therefore need to distinguish the studies in the entire literature base that are replicable versus those that are not. Currently, we only know that about 60% of them will not replicate, but we don't know which one is which. So that's why we replicate specific findings. And then for each finding, so each cell in this grid represent a paper, for example, we could evaluate if that specific one can be successfully replicated. And there are many examples for this type of replications. Some journals like Social Psychology, they called for replications of important results in the field. There's also CRAPE, this organization, they advocate students to choose from a wide range of individual findings and replicate them. And PSA supports the initiative. Every year, I think from 2019, they picked a few studies to replicate on a large scale, mobilizing researchers around the world. So for this type of replication done for the second purpose of assessing specific findings, and an inevitable question is deciding which findings to replicate, because there are so many of them. We know that replications are expensive and takes time. Like filling in these individual cells in this grid is not an easy thing. An average replication could take about 300 days, almost a year to complete. And therefore, we need to decide what to replicate among this whole literature that's in front of us. So it was not a problem for the first type of replication when you want to just estimate the overall reliability, because for that purpose, no matter how large the literature is, you can always just randomly choose a small subset. But for the second purpose, we really need to think about which specific findings to prioritize for replication because of the limited resource we have. So currently, choices for what to replicate largely depends on the researchers' idiosyncratic preferences. Like psychology in general as a field prefers to replicate classic high-impact studies, which is justified. But ideally, this process could be more systematic and guided or structured. In fact, a decision framework has been proposed to characterize this process. It says that choices of what to replicate should be a function of how valuable a finding is and how uncertain we currently are about this finding. How valuable a finding is could be measured by things like citation number or our metric score. If a paper is highly cited, it means lots of people care about whether it's truthful or not, so it's worth replicating. And the good thing about using citation number to measure value is that we have that for every paper. So ideally, we would like to have a similar quantitative measure for how uncertain we are about the finding, something that's like an accurate prediction of replication outcomes and before the actual replication takes place. And it needs to be available for all the papers, or at least a large number of papers that we potentially want to replicate. And the measure for uncertainty, for example, would be something that says a study is estimated to have a 65% chance of being successfully replicated. Unfortunately, we don't yet have an established metric like citation number to measure uncertainty, but we can create one. So in the next couple of slides, I will introduce two prevalent methods used to create this measure of uncertainty. So the first method is prediction market. It relies on crowd wisdom. Experts like professors or postgraduate students, they are invited to bet on whether a study will replicate or not, so using their own judgment. And in each prediction market for a study, the price will fluctuate when people buy and sell about whether a study will replicate. It's like a stock market. And after the market closes, the final price is used as a prediction for the replication outcome. If the price is close to 1, then the outcome is very certain. But if it's 0.5, then it's pretty uncertain. So prediction markets are pretty good at forecasting the actual replication outcomes. It could be a good measure of uncertainty in this decision system. However, one downside of this method is that it's not cheap and fast enough to scale to this entire literature base. Organizing a dozen of prediction markets could take a few months because you need many participants betting over the period of time, and you need to pay them to participate. So this method is more scalable than direct replication, but it's still not applicable to the entire literature that we have with tens of thousands of papers. And so that was prediction market. And the second method is by looking at characteristics of the original studies, like the p-value, the effect size, whether the findings sound surprising or not, and use these metrics as indicators of how uncertain the findings are. I call these metrics, I call these variables as reviewer metrics because they're usually things that reviewer considers when they evaluate a paper. So this second method is low cost, low maintenance. All it takes is to extract these metrics from the original study and use that to measure like where we are about this finding. Are we certain that it will replicate? But the problem is that it has been shown this method is not very accurate in predicting replication outcome. It has some predictive power, but in general, not much. As you can see in these right columns, the correlations between each of these variables and replication outcomes never exceeded 0.3. So to summarize, prediction market and reviewer metrics are the two prevalent methods of estimating replication outcomes before the actual replication takes place. And they both provide a quantitative measure, but they both have limitations that make them not ideal for large-scale application and hence not appropriate for our purpose of measuring uncertainty for tens of thousands of papers at a time. So in response to that, my colleagues and I want to propose a new approach. We want to estimate replication outcomes using the text in the manuscript. And our hypothesis is that the information about replicability is embedded in the writing, like how the authors describe their results reflect, say, for example, how confident he or she is in whether the results are replicable. And this pattern might not be immediately observable on the surface, but we can use text analysis combined with machine learning to uncover these complex associations. And to that end, the end goal would be to build a machine learning model that takes in a manuscript and output a score for how likely this paper will replicate. And the score could be our quantitative measure for this uncertainty construct. This approach has two main advantages that makes it viable. First, it's entirely automated and therefore it's fast and cheap. This whole process runs in machine time and can therefore be scaled to tens of thousands of papers. And the second advantage is that it's highly standardized and generalizable. Any research finding that we care about has a manuscript. And unlike reviewer metrics, if one paper reports p-value and then another reports AUC or accuracy, that would make it really hard to standardize across many different papers. So here's an overview of the method. So first, we will take a sample of studies that have already been replicated. And for each of these papers, we have the text, and we can take the text, like extract the text in the manuscript, and we know their replication outcome. We know that they have been replicated or not. And then we can train a machine model. Before that, we would convert the text in the papers into vectors or numbers that represent the content or the meaning of the paper. And then we can train a machine model to predict the replication outcome from the text. And after the model is calibrated, we can then use it on any future manuscript and then make a prediction about whether this paper is going to replicate. And the prediction will be a score ranging from 0 to 1. So it could be a good uncertainty measure in this decision system. So in the next couple of slides, I will unpack how we build a machine learning model like that, especially how we can teach the model to understand the content of the papers. So the first step is to define like individual words using vectors or numbers. It's like constructing a dictionary, teaching the machine to understand what each words mean. And the basis for doing that is to look at the context in which each word in a paper occurs. So to that end, we collected 2 million abstracts from social science papers in order to teach the machine to understand what each word means in the context of social science literature. And there are about 9 million sentences in the abstracts, in all of the abstracts. And these sentences provide the context for which the words appear in them. And specifically for each word in each sentence, we extracted 5 words that appeared before it and 5 words that appeared after it. For example, in this sentence, there are many questions that our analysis does not address. We can extract pairs of words like there and are, there and many, there and questions, there and that, there and are. So those are pairs of words that are neighbors that appeared in the same context in a sentence. And once we did that, we can move on to the next word in the sentence and do the same thing, extracting are and there, are and many, are and questions. And after going through all the sentences, we have information about how many times each word co-occurred with all other words in the same context. So this giant word by word co-occurrence matrix characterizes that kind of relationship. And then we could use a model called word2vec to condense these co-occurrence relationship. And the result would be each word now could be efficiently represented by a vector. The vector has 200 dimensions, where 200 is just a parameter that we set. And on the right of the screen, you can see the visualization for the first 3 dimensions for a bunch of words. And I'll explain how to interpret them in a second. But conceptually, this method, under this method, every word is defined by how other words that, like every word is defined by all the other words that it tends to stick together with. And here's an example of why this definition makes sense. So imagine that the word cat and dog, they often occur with the same set of other words like feed and eat and sleep and play in the same sentence. Because of that, cat and dog are considered semantically related or semantically similar by the word2vec model. So in this visualization, you can see that cat and dog are closer to each other in this vector space, while other words like unrelated words like analysis, experiment, and report are clustered further away from cat and dog. So for those of you who are not familiar with word2vec, you can think of it as doing what factor analysis tries to achieve. And the 200 dimensions are just equivalent of factors. Despite that, the underlying techniques can be quite different. So now we have the vectors that define each word. The second step is to go to our papers and count how many times each word appears in each papers. And once we have that, we can multiply the word frequency with the corresponding word vectors in step 3. And as a result, we now have vectors that represents the content of the papers. So from step 1 to step 3, we went from constructing word vectors to converting papers to vectors. And finally, we can train a machine learning model that predicts replication outcomes from these vectors of papers. And in terms of the algorithms, I just used an ensemble of 2 very common ones, random forest and logistic regressions. So hopefully I have unpacked the methodology and you can appreciate how the text in the manuscript are represented using this high dimensional vectors. And that's why the relationship between text and replication outcomes are very complex. They're 200 dimensions, and they're not intuitively intelligible. And here are the data that we use to train the model. There are 388 studies that have ever been replicated in psychology. There are more now, but when we were running the study, there are 388 studies in psychology. And from these studies, the machine model will learn to identify signals of replication from text. And admittedly, this is a small sample for the standard of machine learning, and indeed the limitation of our study. I am, however, monitoring new replications constantly and adding them to our training sample. And once we finish training the model, each paper in the training sample will receive a score for how likely they will replicate. And then we can compare that score with the actual replication outcome to evaluate how accurate the model is. And here are our results. So in this chart, the y-axis is the predicted score, that each paper has. And the x-axis is just their ranking, like from low to high. And each dot is a paper. And the red dots are studies that are in reality like failed replication, and green dots are successful ones. So you can see that papers with lower scores on the left are mostly red dots that failed replications, and those on the right are mostly green dots that were successful in replications. So in total, the model was correct about 73% of studies. And this performance isn't great for a machine learning task. However, what we are most interested in is comparing the performance with other existing methods. If our method is at least better than reviewer metrics, for instance, then it's already an improvement worth implementing. So we went back to the reviewer metrics, like just to recall that there are original p-values, original effect size in the paper, things like that. And we use these reviewer metrics to build the same model in predicting the replication outcome. And we found that the reviewer metrics model has lower accuracy of 0.66. So this shows that our text model is at least better than one existing method and provides some new information about how likely a paper will replicate. We also compared our method with prediction markets, and there are about 100 studies in our sample that also has undergone prediction markets. For this subset of the data, the prediction market has an accuracy of 0.83, but while our accuracy for this subset of data is 0.76. So prediction market is still higher, it's still more accurate than our method. However, as I said, the higher accuracy comes with higher costs of executing the prediction markets. You could forecast for maybe 24 of papers in 3 months using prediction markets, but our model could be applied to tens of thousands of papers at a time, free of cost. So both methods have their advantages. Okay, in the next couple of slides, I would like to address a few potential questions related to the mechanism of the text model. One concern is that the model was just predicting the identity of the authors, like because writing style tend to reflect the author's identity. Some people worry that you're just using the identity of the author as a shortcut for predicting replication outcome. So to be clear, for the model to use author identity as a proxy for replication outcome, the replication rate has to first differ for authors with different characteristics. Like men and women will have different replication rate, and that's why our model could pick up on that, could pick up on the different writing styles between men and women and use that as a shortcut for predicting replication outcome. However, we knew from our training sample that replication rates did not differ by the gender of the author, by the race of the author, or the institution, like whether it's a prestigious institution, whether it's a less prestigious school that the authors are from. So there's no way that our model is using this information as a proxy. And the second concern is that the model was predicting subdiscipline, like whether this paper is a social psychology paper or cognitive psychology paper, and use that as a proxy for predicting replication outcome. This is possible because the base rate of replication does differ between social and cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is higher, social psychology is lower. So to test whether this concern is legit, we separated the data into social versus cognitive psychology and trained a model on social psychology studies only, and then predict for cognitive psychology and vice versa. So this way, the model cannot predict the discipline. There's no discipline information embedded in the model. And we didn't observe any significant drop in the performance. So it shows that subdiscipline isn't crucial to the model for predicting replication outcome. And the third speculation was that the model was capturing differences in individual word choices. For example, papers that failed replications tend to use certain words like remarkable more often. And if that is true, then there's really no need to use the complex word-to-vec model. We can just use the frequency. We can just count the frequency of words and use that to predict replication outcome. But that does not seem to be the case for two reasons. First, we did build a simpler model based only on the frequency of words, and that model did not perform well at all. And second, we used a technique that would pinpoint which individual words were driving the model's decisions. And we found that the model decided multiple papers to be similarly replicable based on different words. So there are no common words that were driving the model's decisions across different papers. So it wasn't about individual word choices. And this led us to think that if it's not individual words, then it must be combination of words. And indeed, we found that papers that failed replications are more likely to use uncommon combinations of words. And so we look at how frequently combinations of words appeared, and we found that papers that failed replications tend to use words that are not commonly used across all the authors. And this is consistent with our initial hypothesis that the relationship between text and replications are high dimensional. There's a question in chart, do you think prediction performance would improve if you had access to more data for training? Yeah, definitely. We're constantly adding our predictions. So, this paper is already a second iteration of our previous proof of concept paper. In previous paper, we had less training sample and the performance was worse than the current one. So I do think as replication studies accumulate, we would be seeing a better performance. Okay, so back to the slide. So these are my questions, so some of the questions you might have about the mechanism of the model. So I just wanted to throw them out there for clarification. So back to this methodology. So I have presented how machine learning model works in predicting replication outcome. And the next step is to put it into practice, like to predict replication outcomes for actual papers. In other words, we will feed existing psychology papers into this model and then get a score for how likely they will replicate. And this outcome could be a good measure of the uncertainty measure in this decision system. So I chose 6 top journals representing 5 subdisciplines in psychology, ranging from clinical psych to social and personality psych, as well as a journal Psychological Science as a top multidisciplinary journal that covers all of these subdisciplines. So together there are about 14,000 papers in total published in these top tier journals in the past 20 years. And next, I will input this manuscript into the model. And here are the results. The x-axis is the predicted replication outcome. It's a score from 0 to 1. And the y-axis is the frequency. And here's the histogram. You can think of it as a replication ranking. So presumably studies on the left end has a lower chance of being successfully replicated than those on the right. And those in the middle are the ones that are the most, we are currently most unsure about. So I envision that these scores could be divided by subdisciplines in psychology, and there are 5 of them. There's like one table for social psychology, one for developmental, one for personality. And these tables could serve as a guidance for which studies should be replicated first in each subdiscipline. Take developmental psychology as an example. If we sort the table by the score, those in the front rows are the studies that we would predict that they will likely fail replication, and those in the last rows are studies that we predict to be successful in replication. And those in the middles are the ones that we're currently most unsure about. And according to this decision framework, we should replicate those studies in the middle with the highest uncertainty first. But don't forget that we should also consider how valuable knowing the replication outcome is. So it's a function of value and uncertainty. So this table could be to examine the value of knowing the outcome. This table could be expanded to include the citation number, our metric scores, and together we could decide, say, for a set of studies that are both highly cited and has a replication score that's currently in the middle. And in addition to that, we could have another column that evaluates how feasible it is to conduct the replication. We could have research assistant code, whether it's a longitudinal study that takes many years to complete, and whether it involves hard to reach population, and whether it could be easily executed online. And based on this feasibility measure, you could have different groups of researchers to replicate them. For example, for easy studies that could be executed online, it's probably best for undergraduate students who is doing a dissertation to replicate it. But for like harder studies, like with those hard to reach population, it's better to use like PSA to involve researchers around the world to do the replication. So I did this study with psychology because I'm a psychologist and this is my field, but this approach could certainly be repeated in any other discipline like economics. Okay, so this is all I have for my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions for maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes if anyone has any, or have a discussion about what you think should be prioritized for replication first before we move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Yu, for this very interesting talk. I must say that I think it raises so many questions, and that's good. Okay, so I see a couple of hands. Oh, no, this is clap, right? Or do you also want to ask something? So if someone wants to ask, I think you can raise your hand or turn on the microphone. You can also ask using the chat. So I can start by doing, as I was seeing your presentation, and in particular the slides on the female and male gender, I remembered that some time ago a colleague of mine presented some data on the writing style of men and women.
Yeah.
And that sometimes that leads to different grant appreciation. So women have less grants, they say. I don't think it's very, it's really for sure, but they suggest that it might be a gender issue, a writing style. So I would say I can leave here the paper, the link. So
yeah,
you know the study. What do you think of it, and how this connects with your results?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. You could. It's not surprising that we observe a difference between genders or between other author identities in writing style. However, my point was that even though there is a difference, it doesn't matter for our purpose. Like as long as men and women didn't have different replication base rate, like women are more replicable or men are more replicable, then it doesn't affect that we predict them because our model doesn't care whether men and women. It's not capturing writing style for the purpose of capturing writing style. It's capturing writing style for the purpose of predicting replication outcomes. So as long as men and women do not differ in their replication rate, then having a different writing style between genders doesn't affect like my model's prediction.
But this presuming that actually the writing style of men and women do not affect the way their text is seen as more replicable or not. I mean,
yeah, it wouldn't affect.
Okay, so yeah. Because you think that what's in the base, it's the replicability of the. Okay.
Yeah.
I will pass the word now.
Okay.
I think that there were some other questions. I'll start maybe with Anna. I believe it's the one I saw. Oh, no, sorry, it was Anna. No, it was.
I think there was one in the chat.
Sheila?
Yeah, second that one.
Yeah, I saw a question in chat. So it says, suppose the PSU could run 100 replication studies to validate your replicability score method. How would you recommend we go about doing that? Yeah, so that would be, so first of all, running additional studies would first validate our method, like we could compare so our prediction versus the end results. And also it could be added to the training sample, right? It could be like right now, I only have 388 studies that have been replicated. And after that, I will have 1,388 studies. So it will make future studies more replicable. And but the point, like when PSA replicates it using this our predicted score as a guidance to what to replicate first, the point wasn't so much about validating method. The point was about validating the study itself, right? So our method is just as a preliminary screen for what to replicate. It's not definitive at all. You shouldn't use my metric, my score to say, oh, I think this study cannot be replicated, so I don't believe the results. It's just a guidance. It's a first filter for what to replicate. And at the end of the day, the final say is still given to the direct replication. You have to actually do the work and replicate it and to be safe for sure. Whether we think this study should be trusted or not. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That was such a great talk. Thank you. Very interesting. I'm interested to hear more about your thoughts on what to do with those papers with low replicability scores.
Yeah.
So I understand that we simply can't replicate everything, and that it may be valuable to invest resources in replicating studies that are very unlikely to replicate. But do you think there's something that could be done, like a worthwhile follow-up that doesn't cost as much time or money as a large-scale replication, but that could ascertain in some way that those papers with lower replicability scores are indeed not robust or reliable, so that they like stop taking up space in the literature as some sort of foundation?
Yeah. So I think that one approach is that the advantage of my approach is that it can be combined with any other approach, right? So we have a score that says one paper is low on replicability, and then we can probably introduce, if we don't want to go do a full-on replication, we can probably introduce like prediction markets. We can do prediction markets on studies that we think that we are very unsure about, or we don't think they will replicate. And if prediction market confirms that, that's like the second step for confirming that these studies are not very likely to replicate. And apart from prediction markets, the prediction market takes some time. Like you need to like buy and sell, so that's still like taking up quite a lot of time. Besides prediction market, you could just do like surveys, like asking people, do you think this will replicate, and without like involving the whole prediction market mechanism. So these are alternative approach, and using like all of these approach together, and if they agree with each other that certain papers are low on replicability, then we can already begin thinking that, oh, this paper might not be worth trusting, even without doing a replication study. Yeah.
Okay, I think there's a question here in the chat.
Would it make sense to find studies which may have huge impacts of implications like the ones in textbook? Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's actually exactly what I plan to do. So currently, I only took studies from 5 top-tier journals because I think these are studies that people in general in the field would pay attention to. And I thought about adding studies from textbook, or just like having another column in this table to mark that, oh, this is a paper that appeared in many textbooks in social psychology. So that could be another metric that we use to characterize the value of knowing the outcome. And combined with the low replicability scores, these should probably be the studies that we actually spend resources on replicating first. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Okay, we can do more this question.
Do you think the text mining method used could also be used in predicting which studies in the literature are replications and which studies they are replicating? Oh, okay. Yeah, so this will be a different area of prediction. So I collected the studies that were already being replicated, because these are all manually tracked by researchers, like by Curate Science, or so these studies were like manually tracked by people, which study had been replicated by which projects. So maybe currently it's still not very feasible to or it's not very necessary to scan the literature and investigate which studies have been replicated. First of all, replication studies are rare. Like so many people have curated this list, and there are only like 388 studies that have been replicated. And second of all, because there are so few of them, and people have already spent time keeping track, and there are websites like Curate Science or PsycFile or like Crape that's already being giving us a list of studies that have been replicated. So I don't think it's necessary to go back to the literature and find out which studies have been replicated or not.
Okay, thank you. I think we should move on.
Yeah.
If you have any more questions, you can ask them in the end if we have time, or you can ask them directly to the author.
Okay. Cool. Mm-hmm.
So we now move to the second talk, which is about examining the effect of mask wearing on face and emotion recognition, cross-cultural online study. And this will be presented by Aiswan Lee. I'm sorry for the way I say it. And I will now pass the words.
All right, I will share the screen then. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Is it the duplicate view or
You're sharing your presentation notes slide.
Okay, I'll remove the other monitor then. Unplug the other monitor.
No, this is in presentation mode. I don't think removing the other.
Yeah,
okay.
this is good now.
This right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the help. And very nice presentation, Yo-Yo. I will be presenting this on mask wearing, as we have been wearing masks for the last year plus or so. This was done by me. I'm a lecturer in psychology at Sunway University, Malaysia, and Ho Kiat Wong, assistant professor at University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and Dr. Ian Stephen, who is at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. So faces provide valuable information for social settings. We need to know who we have interacted with, and faces also tell us who is attractive, trustworthy, dominant. It also shows cues to health, leadership, and many more cues. The thing is, with face masks covering half the face, individuals may have to rely on fewer cues, which would be the top half of the head, to recognize faces and emotions. So when we only see the top half of the head, this might influence the way we recognize other individuals, whether familiar or unfamiliar or faces, and interacting with other people, because we may or may not be able to guess their emotion behind the mask. And also it is thought that holistic processing may be disrupted because the mask occludes the lower part of the face. While face processing is generally holistic in nature, as in we look at faces in a holistic manner across cultures, but eye tracking studies have found that individuals from different ethnic groups tend to use different looking strategies with, for example, Western Caucasians looking at the eyes and the mouth region, and East Asian participants looking at the central region, which is the nose region, and Malaysian Chinese participants using a intermediate strategy combining the eyes and the nose. So if face masks disrupt holistic recognition by removing crucial information, will face recognition be impacted? We also know that people are able to recognize own race faces, better than other race faces, a phenomenon known as the own race bias. So when we have mask on the face, will the ORB also remain robust with face mask? A recent study by Freud and colleagues found that face masks strongly impaired face recognition on the Cambridge face memory task. So in this presentation, we will present data from 2 studies examining the effect of face masks on face recognition using a CFMT task, and also emotion recognition, preliminary data on emotion recognition. We would like to see if face masks cause changes in recognition accuracy when learning and recalling faces, when learning and recalling, and also when we recognize emotions. And we also want to see if the effects of face masks are also influenced by race of observer, as in Malaysian Chinese or Caucasian participants, or by the race of face, as in Chinese face stimuli or Caucasian face stimuli. So in the first study, we used a CFMT paradigm, Cambridge face memory task, with 2x2x2x3 mixed design. We recruited 64 Malaysian Chinese participants and 68 white Australian participants aged between 18 to 30 years old. And I'll show you the examples of stimuli in the next slide. So in the classic CFMT task, you have participants to recognize, like A, memorize one face, and then they had to identify which face they just saw. And then there's a increase in difficulty levels where they have more faces to learn. And then finally, there is a noise condition where the faces are covered with noise, much like what you see in CCTV footage. So in the current study, some participants learned with a mask, but had to recall faces without mask. Some participants learned with no mask and recognize with a mask. And the Chinese and Caucasian faces were presented in a counterbalance order. So in this figure here, actually participants saw both Caucasian and Chinese faces, except some saw Caucasian faces first and Chinese faces later, and vice versa. So our results showed that there was an own race bias, but face masks had had no effect. There was the presence of face mask did not affect recognition performance. They were equally able to recognize faces, whether mask, no mask, or no mask, followed by mask. So in this graph on the top right-hand corner, you can see that Malaysian Chinese, there was an own race bias in a Malaysian Chinese sample. And you can also see in the bottom right graph that there was a difference in the noise condition in terms of Chinese faces. In the second study, we looked at emotion recognition. So we presented faces of the 6 basic emotions for Chinese faces and Caucasian faces. We have so far 50 Malaysian Chinese participants, and data collection is still ongoing. We also presented these face emotions in 4 different conditions. Some participants used only full faces. Some participants only look at the faces with the face mask. Some faces were covered with books and mobile phones. So apart from unlike other studies, why did we put a book and mobile phone condition? We thought that if people looked at the just face mask, there could be some sort of negative health connotation or pathogen discussed. So we wanted to be sure that there was no difference between face masks and other things that occlude an eye, or also things that we commonly see in everyday life, like a book or mobile phone. And participants also rated faces for perceived trustworthiness, likability, and closeness. So these are examples of the stimuli that they saw: the full face, covered with a book, covered with a mobile phone, and with a face mask. And then they had to judge which emotion they just saw, and then rated on a Likert scale for trustworthy, likability, and closeness. Our preliminary data shows that for emotion recognition, there was no own race bias. Overall, as predicted, emotion recognition was better in full faces than when faces were covered. And post hoc comparisons suggest that their accuracy for sad and disgust were affected to a certain extent by the 3 covered faces conditions, suggesting that these 2 emotions, sad and disgust, may be affected more by lower facial features than the other emotions. So what do these results tell us? Overall, for the face recognition study, there was an own race bias in the Malaysian Chinese sample, but there was no own race bias for the emotion recognition study. And why is that? We suggest that people's face processing mechanisms seem to be very flexible, very malleable, especially for face recognition, that we are very quick at adapting to whatever cues that we have in faces, even when holistic processing is disrupted. Perhaps in the Cambridge face memory task, faces were learned in different viewpoints, so participants could have created some sort of mental 3D representation of the faces. And this also suggests that perhaps existing top half features are sufficient for face recognition. But for emotion recognition, covering lower facial features may have some impact on how we recognize certain emotions like sad and disgust. And so this might ultimately influence the ways we gauge social cues and interact with other people. Of course, more data collection is still ongoing, and we are curious to see what's the end result. So limitations is that it's not a direct comparison between recognition and face recognition, emotion recognition, as different stimuli were used, but we thought that it would be nice to see the effect of mask anyway. So yeah, it's not, I wouldn't say it's directly comparable because different stimuli and paradigms were used, but I think it does give us an idea about how flexible we are in face recognition. Future studies could consider the social implications of how we learn. So for example, not just in terms of mask wearing, but when we meet people in 2D with or without mask, do we recognize them in 3D as in real life and vice versa? Children have been at home for the past year plus, and they've not had as much exposure to outsiders apart from their family members. So it will be interesting to test children's recognition abilities and ORB as well, comparing to the previous literature pre-pandemic. And it will also be interesting to know if face mask stimuli would have any difference on gaze patterns in different cultural groups. These are the references, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's very relevant in the current times, and in particular the questions raised and connecting with the children and the development, because they are in a crucial phase. I now ask to the audience if they want to make any question regarding the study. Okay, so I can ask a question. I have been doing in the past emotion recognition studies, facial also, and I think it's very interesting if the emotions are universal or not. And so therefore I think it's very important the study across different countries and cultures, and also potential differences between the different basic emotions that we don't know if they're so basic, or if they're only these 5 basic emotions.
Or the nuances. I would also think a dynamic stimuli, as in real life situations with and without mask, could be interesting as well, because I mean the way we see static images and the way we gauge real life situations with moving stimuli, I think that might be of some influence also.
And I was looking at your data, if you had some differences, because sometimes looking at the data, from my data at least, I had the impression that happiness and happy faces were different from all the rest. I don't know if you're very tuned to detect happy faces compared with all the other different emotions. If you find anything from your data, it didn't seem
I
like.
think for happy and the rest, there was not much difference. It was only sad and disgust that were different in terms of the mask. But in terms of the shape of the graph, I could reshare my screen and show you the graph.
Because with the smiles, there's also that thing of the eyes.
Yeah,
if it's a Shen smile because you use the eyes and other emotions. In fact, disgust, you use more the way you put the mouth and the nose.
The mouth. Sad would be like.
It might be hard to distinguish both. In particular, I think another. I'm making questions since I don't see any raised hands, but if somebody wants to raise the hand, please, or do a question in the chat. I was wondering if because here you present the faces without the context, and there has been studies in the literature that say that we're very bad at recognizing, or maybe there's an issue if we don't consider the context. Maybe if we could see a face, a sad face with a mask, but in a context that would tell us that this face might be sad, would you think it would change your results? Do you think it's relevant to include also the context?
That's a very good question. I think it would, because the context would certainly give more cues to the face, even with a mask. So you're not really looking so much at a mask anymore, but you're looking, you're looking at the face and the context and making a more educated guess.
This is not an idea for me. I'm telling this because, for instance, Lisa Feldman Barrett, she has also some talks on this, and the problem of artificial intelligence detecting the emotions in faces is that sometimes they don't consider the context. But as the previous talk showed us, maybe we can tell artificial intelligence to consider a context. We need to tell them how to consider that context, but maybe it's actually relevant because we don't see faces in a blank.
Yeah, it's not very ecologically realistic per se.
So any other questions or questions regarding the first talk? I think we have here still some time, so we can discuss some issues that raised, some late questions that arise. Meanwhile,
a question for the second set of speakers. In your first study, the recognition study, do you think that the potential differences in how white and East Asian participants view the face, drive results in some way?
Sorry, the line, could you please repeat?
Yeah. So you found a difference in the first study where there was an other race effect for Malaysian participants, but not for the white Australian participants. Do you think that that is driven by the differences in gaze patterns that you talked about, like Rachel Jack's work?
I have a slight suspicion, although not confirmed, that the pool of participants in the Australian sample may have been very exposed to Asian samples, because it's in Macquarie at Ian's previous university. So there's a huge Asian population there, and that may have played some sort of role. I think if you did the same study in a very white university, I think you might find slightly different results.
Okay.